Hello and welcome to the CivilNet podcast. Usually we have a bit longer thing in store for you, but this time around we have a story that is just completely burning up the news cycle. So we wanted to address it immediately with a kind of flash podcast for you. It's really short. We have an issue that you may have heard about already, that the Prime Minister is locked in a very ugly war of words with the church hierarchy. They've not been on good terms for a while, but what's been going on over the past week has just been beyond the pale. So to help us understand what's going on, we have our commentator, Eric Hagopian here.
Pleasure to be here.
So what do you make of what's going on here?
Well, I think first you have to deal with the issue at hand, and then you try to understand the background of this, or actually the greater political context. As far as the rhetoric going back and forth, and most of the rhetoric as far as accusations are coming from the Prime Minister's side, frankly, they're completely unacceptable. That kind of language, because at the end of the day, no matter what anybody thinks of any of these figures, they're actually citizens of this country, and the leader of this country should not be in a business of launching what are not issue type attacks or questions, but very personal ones. Those personal ones might actually be true, but they're absolutely irrelevant to this case. The leader of the country in a democratic state should not be using language like that about public citizens and making accusations of that sort. Again, I don't want to get into details of what's true or not. Everybody knows many of the things that he has actually said are rumored to be in Armenia. Anybody who lives here knows about them. I'm not going to get into the specific allegations. But this is a very ugly scene, and if his intent was to criticize the church or church's involvement in politics, there were frankly far better ways of doing so. He could have simply outlined the fact that the church was silent for 20, 25 years when there was all kinds of criminality in this country, vote buying, corruption, and half a dozen different things. Unfortunately, many of them the church itself might have been involved in. So you can put it in that context where you guys weren't speaking all those years, and suddenly in the last few years, you've been actively involved in politics. But going back to first principle, his approach and the language that he used is something that's unacceptable and that nobody can really condone them.
Yeah, we had, from a political standpoint, the church back in 2020, after the war, called for his resignation. We then saw last year the Bagrat Surprazan movement that was calling for him to step down. And so they've had a lot of enmity, but what Pashinyan's been saying on his Facebook is extremely personal, where the church has not really gone down to that level. They seem to, they're criticizing him in a political way, but not in a personal way. And it's reminiscent of how a certain U.S. president uses his social media. So what is the political aspect behind this?
I think all of this needs to be understood in the context of next year's elections. If you look at, there's a pattern. A couple of weeks ago, they had a set-up fight with Kocharyan and his son in the parliament. And if you look at it, what they're doing is they're systematically lining up the opponents they want to run against next year. One is Kocharyan, now it's the church, and who knows what they'll move on to next. And they're essentially lining up very unpopular people to run against. Now, in polling, the church institutionally comes across as positive, but I think that polling is misleading because the way you ask it, it's a very general attitude towards faith itself, and most people are going to be positive, but there's a great deal of skepticism about church leadership in Armenia. So this has to be understood in the context of they're lining up the enemies for next year. And the church is actually a very convenient one. Secondly, it's very clear that there's going to be intense Russian involvement in next year's elections. Different people they're going to be propping up. And obviously in their toolkit, the church will be part of it. If you look at the way the Russians behaved in other similar countries, they always try to weaponize the church as a force against whatever pro-Western government there is. And I think this was a very graphic attempt to smash the church as a political institution, not to allow them to become a political instrument next year. I think that's what explains the ferocity and the sort of the gutter level language that's addressed to them. So all of this needs to be understood in the context of next year's elections and the underlying fear of who Russia might weaponize next year's elections. Now, we have to be careful with all of this because this government is going to try to put every opposition figure that arises as somehow they will try to put doubt in them as they're somehow Russian tools. So that's complete demagoguery. But at the same time, there are going to be foreign actors, specifically Russia probably being the primary one, they're going to try to play here. What's difficult for the average citizen is where do you divide the two? Where is it that you don't fall for the demagoguery of the government, but you also notice a foreign actor who's trying to affect our elections? And that's far easier said than done. And I'm afraid what we have seen is the first glimpses of a very ugly election season and ugly election year that we're going to have over the next 12 months.
So that's what we have to prepare for. And as I said, it's something that is not unique at all to Armenia, though we see it here more and more. One politician referred to this as like the Doggization of politics, Dog being a really like gutter type blogger who then formed a political party and had quite a following. He's now actually in ICE detention. And so that's a really bizarre story on its own. But yeah, what do you make of that?
I think, yes. I think this is the Doggification, of politics, which means that rhetoric that in the past would not have been acceptable has become acceptable through the coarseness of the culture itself. This kind of language, as I said, is unacceptable, but it's frankly routine on social media where everybody can say what they want. So you have is a general lowering of discourse and lowering of standards, which unfortunately is universal. It is naive to believe that the world is going to watch Donald Trump or other people in other countries, whether it's Argentina or wherever, and not resort to the same kind of language and a rhetoric. So I think what we're having is you're having a political language that used to be elevated in a way. It might have been phony, but it was elevated to what's in popular culture. There's actually a merging of popular culture and politics. So I think that's what we're dealing with here. It's an unfortunate phenomenon, but at the same time, we should not accept it. And this is not useful in any way. And this kind of behavior cannot be condoned. And we need to constantly demand a greater standard. Because I think even politically, I'm not sure how much this really helps the prime minister. Yes, there are some people that this appeals to, but there's just as equal number of people who are not fans of the church who will be repelled by language of this sort, even if they sometimes agree with the content.
We got to demand better. Thank you very much, Eric, for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining the CivilNet podcast.